Welcome back. When we left off last time, the Empire was still wrestling with the idea of icons and whether they belonged in Christian worship, a question raised by Leo III in 730, sparking a conflict that was to last for a century. Since Leo's death, confidence in the idea that iconoclasm would bring God's favour was waning after a series of military defeats to the new Abbasid dynasty. Iconoclasts had become a minority, albeit a minority who held most of the positions of power in the empire, including the emperor himself, Theophilus. Theophilus' empress, another Theodora for those of you who remember Justinian the Great, was a different matter. Theodora became regent for her young son Michael III after Theophilus died. Theophilus had persecuted iconophiles, but Theodora herself was secretly sympathetic to icons. As regent, she had to balance loyalty to her late husband's memory with the need to reconcile the empire with the majority of clergy and population who favoured icons. In 843, Theodora convened a synod at the Hagia Sophia and appointed Methodius I as Patriarch of Constantinople, replacing the iconoclast hierarchy. The council formally restored the veneration of icons and condemned iconoclasm. To protect her son's legitimacy, Theodora declared that Theophilus had repented of iconoclasm on his deathbed, which allowed her to honour her husband while reversing his policy, avoiding charges of disloyalty. There's no actual evidence of this change of heart, and it does seem a bit suspicious given how diligently Theophilus had persecuted iconophiles during his life. It's much more likely that this was something Theodora made up, and because the majority of the empire was iconophile anyway, it was just more convenient to believe it than question it. The ending of iconoclasm seems almost anticlimactic. No great final battle, no stirring speeches. Just a change of personnel, a proclamation, and a century of conflict was all over. Can it really have been that easy? The fact is that the iconoclastic policy was dictated and enforced by the emperor himself. For as long as there were iconoclast emperors, iconoclasm survived. Replace an iconoclast leader with an iconophile, and, with a sympathetic church to support the policy, icons were back. This had happened previously, but this time it was to stick. Theodora raised Michael as a committed iconophile, so he would continue the policy. On March the 11th, 843, a grand procession carried icons back into Hagia Sophia. This ritual became an annual commemoration in the Orthodox Church and is still celebrated. The restoration of icons ended a century of division and argument, bringing peace between church and state, and, by reconciling with the iconophile majority, Theodora strengthened her son's position on the throne. Meanwhile, about 700 miles west of Constantinople, the man who would kill Theodora's son and replace him as the emperor was toiling as a peasant in the fields of Macedonia. Basil was born around 811 to a poor family, possibly former captives or refugees, displaced by warfare. Whatever the exact circumstances, Basil's early years were marked by hardship and a lack of privilege. In his early 30s, he travelled to Constantinople seeking his fortune, arriving with nothing but his physical strength, his determination, and a seemingly bottomless well of charisma. His imposing stature and remarkable endurance soon earned him work in the stables of influential aristocrats, which was the first step in a chain of relationships that would propel him upward. Basil's rise depended heavily on his ability to attract powerful patrons. His first major benefactor was a wealthy courtier named Theophilus, who noticed Basil's physical prowess and brought him into his household. Through Philophilates, Basil gained access to the imperial court and its intricate networks of influence. The turning point came when Basil impressed Emperor Michael III during a horse-handling demonstration in the Hippodrome by controlling and taming a notoriously wild horse. This wasn't just entertainment. In Byzantine culture, physical prowess and horsemanship were manly ideals. These are the things that make a man. And horsemanship was especially important because that was closely linked to imperial imagery of martial dominance and masculine authority. By excelling in these areas, Basil showed himself as someone who embodied desirable manly qualities. Michael, often called Michael the Drunkard, which gives you some idea of his reputation, was known for his impulsive and indulgent personality, and he took an immediate liking to Basil. He brought him into his inner circle, where his loyalty, strength, and adaptability made him indispensable, and the emperor increasingly relied on him for personal and political support. Once inside the palace, Basil's ascent accelerated. He was granted prestigious titles, culminating in his appointment as Perikoimemnos, the High Chamberlain, one of the most powerful positions in the empire. His influence grew further when he married Eudokia, who had been Michael III's mistress, and probably still was. This unusual arrangement, probably orchestrated by Michael himself, bound Basil even more tightly to the emperor, and in 866 CE the peasant from Macedonia reached the pinnacle of courtly advancement when Michael crowned him co-emperor. Basil's relationship with Michael was not without tension. As Basil's power grew, so did his ambition. The partnership between the two co-emperors deteriorated, fueled by political rivalries, personal entanglements, and shifting alliances within the court. Basil had risen astonishingly fast, from peasant to stablemaster to co-emperor in around 10 years, give or take. That kind of meteoric ascent depended entirely on Michael's favour. Basil must have known that if Michael's move shifted, his position would collapse just as quickly. Michael was known for being mercurial, easily swayed by favourites. Basil had seen how Michael discarded others, and he knew loyalty didn't guarantee permanence. Some sources suggest Michael began favouring another courtier, Basiliskianos, and may have considered elevating him, which would have threatened Basil's position as co-emperor. Something Basil decided would have to be done. By 867, Michael was drinking heavily and alienating much of the court. His erratic behaviour made Basil's position precarious. New favourites were emerging, and Basil feared being sidelined at best. Contemporary sources suggest Michael had started hinting that Basil was expendable, possibly planning to elevate another co-emperor. This was the clearest signal to Basil that his days were numbered. A few years before all this, Michael had forced Patriarch Ignatius out of office and installed Photius, a brilliant lay scholar, in his place. In Rome, Pope Nicholas I took exception to this and condemned Photius's appointment as uncanonical. In response, Photius convened a council in Constantinople and excommunicated Nicholas and the whole Western Church. This deepened the existing East-West rift, but was very popular in Byzantium. Many Byzantine bishops rallied behind Photius, viewing Rome's interference in Ignatius's deposition as an unacceptable intrusion. For ordinary Byzantines, the issue was less about theology and more about sovereignty. The excommunication symbolised resistance to perceived Western dominance. All of that will become important in a moment, but for now we concentrate on a night in September 867 just outside of Constantinople. Michael has invited Basil to a banquet at the palace of St. Mamas. As the meal progressed, Michael, who has also invited Basiliskianos, becomes increasingly drunk and starts openly mocking Basil, even openly threatening to replace him. Basil interprets this humiliation as the final warning. If he doesn't strike immediately, he'll be dead. According to later accounts, Basil coordinates with relatives and supporters, tampers with the locks and security arrangements at the palace, and gains access to Michael's bedchamber once the emperor and Basiliskianos are insensible from drink. The conspirators then kill both men in the darkened room. The justification is that Michael has become unstable and dangerous to the empire, but the deeper motive is Basil's fear of being replaced. The next day, Basil is crowned sole emperor, and he immediately dismisses Photius and reinstalls Ignatius as patriarch. Photius was admired for his scholarship and defiance of Rome, but Basil needed political survival, not intellectual prestige, and replacing him allowed Basil to reverse all of Michael and Photius's religious policies, including the excommunication, restoring relations with the West, and preventing possible objections to Michael's removal. Basil explained to Pope Hadrian II that his motive was to restore order and unity in the Church, not personal loyalty to Ignatius. He framed the move as a political necessity to end dissension. Basil sent Photius into monastic retirement, most likely at the monastery of Skepsis. This was the standard way of neutralising high-ranking clerics without resorting to execution. Photius was later formally anathematized and condemned, his writings attacked, and his patriarchal acts declared invalid. But this was a spiritual and reputational punishment, not a physical one. Unlike some rivals in Byzantine history, Photius was not blinded, mutilated, or imprisoned. He was treated with relative restraint, reflecting both his stature as a scholar and Basil's desire to avoid alienating factions unnecessarily. During exile, Photius continued to write, indicating he retained access to books and correspondence, and suggesting his punishment was confinement rather than harsh deprivation. By removing him from office and condemning him at council, Basil neutralised Photius's influence without provoking martyrdom or unrest. It was, as the saying goes, nothing personal, just business. And there's one final twist in the tale here. 10 years later, Ignatius died of old age, and Basil had to choose his replacement. He chose Photius, who was quietly restored to the position from which he had been sacked 10 years previously. Once becoming emperor, Basil faced the immediate challenge of restoring stability and prestige to the empire. It wasn't just political military reforms that he prioritised, though. He also recognised that the cultural and intellectual vitality of Byzantium was crucial for its revival. He understood that a well-educated population and a thriving artistic community could enhance the legitimacy of his rule and reinforce the empire's identity. So, he began to actively support scholars and artists, laying the groundwork for a cultural renaissance. One of Basil's first initiatives was the promotion of educational institutions, particularly the University of Constantinople. By reallocating resources and funding, he helped create an environment conducive to scholarly pursuits. Under his patronage, the university became a centre for theological and philosophical studies, bringing together learned individuals who would contribute to the intellectual life of the empire. Scholars were encouraged to explore ancient texts, philosophy, and rhetoric, which were essential for developing critical thinking skills. Basil seemed to understand that the preservation of ancient knowledge was paramount. He actively supported scribes and translators, fostering a culture of manuscript transcription. It may not sound like much, but this initiative was vital, especially considering the loss of many texts during previous periods of instability. By hiring talented scribes, Basil ensured that many works of classical literature, philosophy, and science were copied and preserved. These texts include the work of Aristotle, Plato, and other ancient luminaries which had been largely forgotten in the West after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The scribes worked diligently to keep this intellectual heritage alive, and Basil's efforts made him a key player in this ongoing cultural preservation. As the years went on, the impact of Basil's support for education and the arts began to show. The intellectual climate in Constantinople flourished. Scholars not only studied ancient works, but also engaged in debates and discussions that encouraged innovation and the development of new ideas. This invigorated atmosphere attracted bright minds to the capital, creating a network of thinkers who were not only invested in preserving the past, but also in advancing contemporary knowledge. This intellectual revival is often viewed as the beginning of the Macedonian Renaissance. I mentioned in the introduction to this series that many of the negative impressions of Byzantium come from Edward Gibbon, and this is a good example, I think, of where Gibbon was unfair, if not mistaken. He described the empire as characterised by a lack of original thought and innovation in philosophy and the sciences, and argued that the intellectual life of Byzantium was largely a repetition or imitation of earlier classical traditions rather than the rise of new ideas or thinkers. Byzantium preserved ancient thinking, but did little or nothing to advance it. However, figures like John the Geometer, Arethius of Caesarea, Constantine VII, Porphyrogenitus, Michael Psellus, Leo Grammaticus, and Theodore of Studios, while not exactly household names, are all examples of innovative or new thinkers who arose from Basil's Macedonian Renaissance. But Basil's efforts had longer-term consequences too. The foundation laid during his reign didn't just benefit contemporary Byzantium, but also had far-reaching implications for the future of European culture. The preservation of classical texts and the intellectual ideas that emerged during the Macedonian Renaissance played a pivotal role in the resurgence of classical values during the Italian Renaissance 5 centuries later. Scholars from Italy travelled to Constantinople, where they encountered the wealth of knowledge preserved by Byzantine scholars. These interactions facilitated an exchange of ideas that were vital to the rebirth of classical learning in Western Europe. The art and philosophy nurtured during Basil's reign continued to resonate beyond the Byzantine Empire. The unique blend of ancient Greek thought and Christian theology developed during this time influenced subsequent generations of thinkers and artists throughout Europe. The revival of classical themes in literature and art found echoes in the works of Renaissance figures such as Petrarch and Leonardo da Vinci, who drew inspiration from the knowledge that had been preserved through Basil's initiatives. It would be entirely too much to call Basil the grandfather of the Italian Renaissance. He lived too far away in time to be a direct influence. But it's certainly fair to recognise his contribution and the fact that his administrative and religious reforms created a stable environment within Byzantium conducive to cultural advancements. Looking to the east, the Arab conquests of the Umayyad and early Abbasid periods had stripped Byzantium of Syria, Egypt, and much of North Africa, and Constantinople itself was besieged twice, making the Caliphate a direct existential threat. But by Basil I's lifetime, the Abbasid Caliphate's fragmentation from a unified caliphate into a patchwork of regional powers meant the initial wave of Arab conquest had passed. The threat had been blunted and was no longer existential but regional, dangerous raids and frontier wars rather than the possibility of Constantinople itself falling. While the Caliph in Baghdad remained the nominal head of the Muslim world, and the Abbasids were still formidable culturally and economically, real power was increasingly exercised by provincial dynasties and military governors, which meant Byzantium could shift from survival to resurgence, preparing for what became the Macedonian dynasty's military expansion in the 10th century. To the west, the opposite was happening as Venice took its first steps as an independent state, free from the Byzantine Empire. Venice had long been a Byzantine dependency, but by the 9th century it was increasingly independent. Under Doge Orso I Participatio, Venice balanced relations between the Byzantine Empire and the Carolingian Empire, which covered most of mainland Europe at the time, maintaining nominal ties to Byzantium while asserting local control. Venice's doges were careful to avoid domination by either power, positioning the city as a neutral maritime hub. Venice continued to recognise Byzantine suzerainty in theory, benefiting from Byzantine protection against Arab raids, and Byzantine recognition helped legitimise Venetian rulers. But in practice, it acted autonomously. Treaties and agreements during this period reinforced Venice's role as a Byzantine ally without direct subordination. Arab fleets, operating from bases in Sicily and North Africa, raided the Adriatic in the 9th century, and Venice's defences and naval patrols protected trade routes and coastal settlements, strengthening Venice's maritime identity and military capacity. Venice's economy grew through trade in salt, fish and luxury goods, linking the Adriatic with Byzantine and Islamic markets. The city's merchants increasingly acted independently, building networks that would later underpin Venice's rise as a commercial empire. While Basil I was consolidating Byzantine power, Venice was quietly evolving into an autonomous maritime state. Its doges used Byzantine recognition strategically, but resisted direct control, ensuring Venice's independence. The combination of Arab threats, Byzantine diplomacy and economic growth during Basil's reign set Venice on the path toward becoming a dominant Mediterranean power in the centuries to come. So, by the end of Basil's reign, Venice was already emerging as a maritime republic distinct from its Byzantine origins. Basil was clearly aware of the growing independence, but while Venice remained nominally loyal and often aligned with Byzantine interests, especially against the Arabs, it enabled Basil to focus on Italy and Sicily, where Arab threats were immediate, rather than trying to reassert direct control over Venice. This was short-term pragmatism, but Venice's autonomy meant Byzantium lost direct control over a strategic Adriatic outpost. Venice's independence was tolerated because it still served Byzantine interests in the Adriatic, but Basil's reign marks the point where Byzantium effectively ceded Venice's autonomy. The long-term consequence was that Venice's independence allowed it to become a commercial rival to Byzantium. Later treaties gave Venice trade privileges, showing how Byzantium had to adapt to Venetian power. Basil died on August 29, 886, after falling from his horse during a military campaign against the Bulgarians in Thrace. Historical accounts indicate that he sustained serious injuries from the fall, which led to his death shortly after. He had restored stability to the throne after the unpredictability of Michael III and strengthened the empire through political consolidation, legal reform and military campaigns. Militarily, Basil crushed the Paulicians in Asia Minor, strengthened Byzantine control in southern Italy through alliances with the Franks and the Lombards, and achieved success against Arab forces in Cilicia and Cyprus. With renewed investment in church building, scholarship and cultural revival, Basil I's reign was the beginning of the Macedonian Renaissance. Next time, we'll look at the emperor who took the empire to the high point of the Macedonian Renaissance, Basil II, whose nickname Basil the Bulgar Slayer tells you everything about the reputation of this fearsome character. Join me for that, but for now, thank you for listening. Please remember to like, share and subscribe on your way out, and whatever you're up to, have a great day.